Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
By now, nobody blinks an eye at the idea of Russian interference. For most people, the concept goes back at least 8 years to the 2016 American election. But really, it goes back decades further. And the former Soviet Union has used that time to perfect the strategy.
The DOJ charged 2 Russian media executives in an alleged plot to illegally funnel millions of dollars to right-wing influencers by way of a pro-Trump media outlet.
In September, we got a glimpse inside how these operations actually work, who they target, and what they hope to achieve. And all you need to do to see the results is read through the conspiracy theories, which you can find under any breaking news story. So what did we learn about Russia's intelligence operation that we didn't know before? What exactly, in concrete terms, do they expect for their investment? Did the personalities that the Department of Justice claims were involved really not know where the money was coming from? And what role does Canada play here? Victim? Facilitator? Or simply caught in the crossfire? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Stephanie Carvin is a former national security analyst, an associate professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, and the author of Stand on Guard, Reassessing Threats to Canada's National Security. Hey, Steph.
Hello.
Why don't you just start by explaining what we've learned about Russian influence operations over the last month or so that we didn't know before and how that came about?
So it's interesting. We learned through this Department of Justice indictment back in September that effectively the United States government had been investigating this channel, this media organization called Tenet Media, for its links with Russian entities, linked in particular to RT, which used to be called Russia Today. It's now just RT, which is effectively a mouthpiece for the Russian government. And we learned that they were being provided millions of dollars in order to produce content that was favorable to Russian interests. That's probably the short form version. But I think really kind of the 2 takeaways here that are important, at least in terms of what we perhaps didn't know before, is that we always assumed that there were, useful idiots. And I'm not crazy about that term, but we often hear the term useful idiots. But because there are people with sincerely held beliefs that are pro-Russia, and we should not call them idiots. These are people who have come to their own decisions. But there was always this idea that there were people out there who were, espousing pro-Russia talking points because because they weren't critical thinkers or they weren't thinking about it, or, that they were kind of perhaps ignoring their own interests. So we can leave that discussion aside, but because that wasn't the case here. These were not necessarily people who were so-called useful idiots. These were people who were paid, and in some cases, a lot of money, right? Millions of dollars. Now, these individuals may still believe the talking points that they were espousing, or at least some of it. But the fact is that from this indictment, we learned that they were actually being given specific talking points to put out on social media, and that there was actually a lot of coordination between this media outlet and the Russian government, or at least Russian-controlled entities. So the fact is that, this was far more direct than I think I had really assumed. And the second thing is that there was a substantial Canadian component to this, right? We're always looking for that elusive Canadian angle, but here it is, pretty in black and white. The media outlet in question, Tenet Media, was unnamed in the indictment that the Department of Justice put out. We should be very clear about that, we're talking about Tenet Media because, reporters have effectively put it together. This is the media outlet in question because of just the sheer amount of evidence that makes it clear that was the entity. But, this was controlled by a Canadian influencer who was known as Lauren Chen and her husband, Leon Donovan. And these were Canadians, and they employed another Canadian, Laura Southern, who's well known in kind of alt-right or far-right media circles for a lot of the content that she produces as well. So, we often will say that, and we've seen, I've been on the podcast before talking about foreign interference, that we haven't really seen a great deal of concrete efforts, coming from Russia that's specifically aimed at Canada. And we do know that Tenet Media was aimed at the United States, but this is a pretty good example of, Russian foreign interference involving Canadians that I think we need to be concerned about.
So this indictment came out of the United States, but as you mentioned, there's the always fun Canadian connection. On a serious note, though, what role does Canada actually play in this? Are we an actual target? Are we just kind of collateral damage or what?
I think this is a really important question because of the way that Russia's been discussed so far in our discussions about foreign interference, at least in the different inquiries we've seen, right? And so far, we know that Canadian intelligence agencies believe our democratic processes are not directly targeted by Russian online foreign interference campaigns. But I think this case actually represents a pretty harsh reminder that Canada is not only affected, but in some ways implicated, right? And I think this really happens in three ways. Canada is in some ways collateral, participant, and example. And by collateral, I mean that our media system is so heavily interlinked with the United States. And, there's a 2021 study which found that Canadian users on Twitter followed far more accounts based in the U.S. than in Canada. And that for every tweet retweeted from a Canadian-based user, 10 tweets are actually retweeted from U.S.-based users. That's how heavily integrated we are with especially on social media accounts, right? So what happens in the U.S., the kind of targeting of U.S. populations also, therefore, impacts us pretty heavily. I think we're a participant, though, because Canadian influence, as we're seeing in this case, are allegedly directly and indirectly involved in these efforts, right? And, we've already mentioned the fact that the media owner and one of the major podcasters or influencers in this network were Canadian. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if there's more Canadians that are involved in these efforts that we just simply may not yet know about. And finally, I suggest that, Canada is this example. And this is what's interesting to me is that, in a lot of these efforts that are being used by Russia, Canada is often represented as this kind of funhouse mirror for other countries out there. Either we're this kind of socialist hellhole or some kind of paradise of free healthcare and liberal norms. And I think all Canadians know that's not true. But when it's set in propaganda, Canada becomes this convenient foil and morality tale for other countries, particularly the United States. So we see these influencers saying, hey, I'm Canada, I live in Trudeau's hellhole, and let me tell you about why you need to elect Donald Trump as a result. So the relationship here with Russia, even if it isn't that direct interference in our electoral processes, it's clearly still having an impact on not just Canada, but I think Canadian interest abroad, and also perhaps the way we as a country are being perceived.
People have been talking about Russian influence and Russian interference for years now. I mean, even for folks who don't pay a lot of attention to national security, probably around the 2016 election was when it first became a larger discussion. How has Russia's strategy evolved since those early days? Like, give us a sense of the context and what it's trying to do here.
So I'm not so sure that it is evolved as it is almost back to basics. So it's kind of actually going back to where we were in the Cold War. And if you think back, during the Cold War, there was actually a lot of effort by the USSR to establish fronts and trusted voices. And by trusted voices, I mean people that you think come from your community and you think are kind of well-grounded in who you understanding who you are and where you come from, and then can speak to perhaps the causes that Russia was supporting. There's a really great book I'd recommend to anyone. It's called Propaganda and Persuasion, The Cold War and the Canadian-Soviet Friendship Society by a historian called Jennifer Anderson. And she actually details a lot of the efforts that were specifically aimed at Canada during the Cold War.
Can you give us an example or two?
Yeah, sure. There was this Canadian-Soviet Friendship Society that was effectively funded by the Soviet Union. And it was run by an individual, Dyson Carter, who during the Cold War, he would he wrote books. One book was called We Saw Socialism and talks about, what a paradise the USSR was. They put out a brochure every month and it was called Northern Neighbors, right? Because the Soviet Union was our neighbor to the north. And, they would actually run these study trips that would take Canadians to the Soviet Union, and they'd see this kind of Potemkin version of the Soviet Union and how great it was and how wonderful it was. So, there really were these efforts to try and promote a more favorable version of the USSR. They also funded a lot of peace activism societies, a lot of societies that were against NATO, for example, because, obviously the Soviet Union was not a big fan of NATO and wanted to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of Canadians. But the point is that it wasn't Russians or Soviets, I should say, that were making these points to Canadians. They were trying to find Canadians in Canada who could say these things largely on their behalf, partially because they believed it, but also because, they were getting money to do so.
Looking for the pre-social media influencers.
Exactly.
When we talk about Russia giving this media company talking points and what their goals are, what does Russia actually want here? I think, a lot of people assume that they have these concrete things, like it wants to get Trump elected, right? But in a bigger sense, what is the goal of this mission?
So I think there are a couple of goals, and many of them are, getting back to your previous question, actually a lot of the same goals that existed during Soviet times, right? One of the key things is they want to undermine citizen confidence in democratic governance, right? So consistently portraying governments as corrupt or controlled by a certain group of elites that are against, the real people, the real Americans, the real Canadians, and things like this. The amplification of politically divisive issues. It's not so often that Russia actually invents things that impact our discussions about, social issues and stuff like that. They actually look for, Clint Watts, who is a former FBI agent and now I believe works for Microsoft in their threat analysis team. He always talks about how Russia is looking for social cracks and trying to turn them into chasms, trying to widen the divide between us and increase polarization, as it were. Because if we're busy fighting ourselves, well, we're probably not going to be busy fighting, international wars that might involve Russia. But other things, eroding trust between citizens and trying to target elected officials and democratic institutions so that Canadians don't believe in them. So lies about election security and, the idea that our elections are vulnerable or that, illegal migrants are voting. This is something we're hearing a lot in the United States right now in particular. And then, obviously things like popularizing the same kinds of foreign policy goals that Russia has, kind of disparaging Ukraine, suggesting that they're Nazis and a Nazi government. And yeah, all of these kinds of issues which seek to really kind of get us wound up, get us mad at each other, that kind of portray Russia as, or at least Russian interests as kind of our real and true goals. This is as true now, I think, as it was, the 1950s and 60s.
Looking at it objectively, glancing down towards the South, how successful would you say they've been so far?
It's hard to say. I think there's clearly, if anyone goes on social media right now, it's definitely a polarized environment. It's a difficult environment. So if they're contributing to that polarization, yeah, they might feel that they're doing well. But from a national security perspective, I think the key thing to remember, it's hard to measure the impact. I think the view from an organization or a security agency like the Canadian Security Intelligence Service or the Communications Security Establishment, both are two kind of spy agencies, is not that they're not trying to measure success. They're looking at the fact that it's happening in the first place, right? That's the problem. And the fact that they're even trying to influence our discourse is, I think, what the problem is. It's not so much whether or not it's successful, right? It's if you think about it, if we use a criminal analogy, it's not so much that someone has successfully robbed a bank. It's the fact that they're trying to do it in the first place that you're trying to stop. In the case of Tenet Media, we can look at them. They had a large number of views. I think Lauren Chen in particular had something like 500,000 subscribers to her media channels. But, there were larger accounts out there, right? Ones that may not be being sponsored by, or probably aren't being sponsored by Russia.
How do you tell the difference?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure we can. This investigation involved intelligence, police sources, banking records, all these different kinds of things. So what would be interesting, I think, is we do see more investigations like this going forward. But it is, I think, in some ways telling that, this happened in the United States, which tends to take a much more aggressive enforcement on these kind of foreign interference issues than I think perhaps Canada does.
And I want to ask you about that in a minute. But first, as the details began to emerge and sort of, as you mentioned, the DOJ might not have named names, but reporters started digging and were very quick to find a number of these influencers. What surprised you about the specifics and the details in this report about what they were doing? Did anything?
What is interesting to me, I think, was the way that in some ways it was so blatant, right? This is, here's some talking points. We would like you to put these in. The kind of negotiations that were clearly taking place between Tenet Media and this Russian-controlled entity about, what is a plausible argument and what isn't a plausible argument. The fact that some of the influencers don't seem to have really questioned where a lot of this money was coming from, but seem to have been happy to just report things that they were asked to either report or say. And, the fact that we've heard so much in recent years about the Russian bot narrative, right? The idea that there's online fake accounts that, really artificial intelligence and deep fakes are going to change our perception of reality. And there's going to be all these fake accounts that are going to shift our perception online. That's not what Russia's doing here. Russia is looking for real human people that people know and trust to spread messages. They're not turning to artificial intelligence, at least not yet. They're not turning to deepfakes, that they really felt like, perhaps some of the old ways were the best, even if it's being applied to a new media environment.
When you look at what people alleged to have been involved in this have said since the indictment came out, you used the term useful idiots before. I guess a lot of these folks have denied that they knew where sometimes substantial amounts of money was coming from. As somebody who studies this stuff, do you find that credible?
These individuals were certainly incurious, and it does, at least to me, raise the question, and I highlight your question, have these people been taking money before? Was this kind of a regular practice that perhaps things went on? But perhaps they knew enough not to ask, right? And let's be clear, in some cases, these people were making $100,000 for, running an episode, right?
$100,000 for a podcast sounds pretty good.
I would think so, right? For someone who perhaps runs a podcast. And so, the amount of money here, either these individuals knew not to ask questions, perhaps because they had done it before, perhaps they just didn't want to know, or perhaps that was their sense of self-worth, right? Yeah, yes, I am worth this amount of money. My content is this. I generate so many views. Either way, I do think it is a little odd, and I think it's a good reminder to people who, when they are offered a substantial amount of money to do things, that there really is perhaps no such thing as a free lunch.
When you look at the landscape in which this is occurring, United States or, as you mentioned, sort of lesser, but still caught by the fire in Canada, what concerns you most going forward?
I'm concerned we're not learning lessons, right? This past weekend, there was a church burning in Quebec. And to be clear, the church was deconsecrated. The church was being converted into condos. And it was, unfortunately, there was a fire, and this historical building appears to have been substantially damaged, if not destroyed. And all of a sudden, we saw on social media all of these talks about how Catholic churches are being targeted and burned. And there have been a lot of church burnings. I'm not disputing this, but even before we knew the cause of the fire, without any suggestion that this was arson. I mean, construction sites are full of dangerous materials. They catch fire all of the time. There were online rumors about, how Catholics are being targeted and victimizing in Trudeau's Canada, right? And there was even edited footage of Trudeau, which talked about this in such a way that made him look like he didn't care. And we do know that even RT itself was posting about this, right? Their Twitter, I still call it Twitter, I know it's X, but they were tweeting about this. And we did see prominent Canadians retweeting this content. And I'm like, guys, the Tenet Media issue was 4 weeks ago.
Right.
Are we learning lessons? And between all of the misinformation that's going out right now about the impact of, Hurricane Helene and the federal response in the United States to that, we are not learning lessons, right? If anything, I think this incident happened. I think some of us may be better educated about the threat, but, so many of us are just so quick to hit that retweet button, to share that content, and to not necessarily think about who it came from and what might be the agenda of the person behind it. And that, to me, is a real concern, right? Having gone through this tenant media issue in Canada, which gained a lot of media attention just a few weeks ago, we seem to have fallen for it almost immediately.
So last thing then, you mentioned that we maybe don't take this as seriously as the United States does. What would we do if we really wanted to get serious about it? And also, is it kind of too late? This stuff is everywhere now.
Yeah, it is everywhere. And I'm not convinced that we're going to easily put the toothpaste back in the tube, as it were. But I think that people are allowed to have their sincerely held beliefs, right? I don't want to sit here and come across saying anyone who tweets stuff that's pro-Russia is immediately either being paid by Putin or a useful idiot or completely delusional.
Right.
People come to their own conclusions. Maybe I disagree with it, but, there are reasons to question, should we be sending military support overseas to conflicts and things like this? These are legit criticisms that should be raised in a democratic government. But where there are these indicators of support, I would love to see more charges, more investigations. In Canada, we're not good at this. We have heard, particularly in the foreign interference inquiry, which is happening right now, that the RCMP is struggling, right, to kind of manage the investigations. And there are structural reasons in the RCMP why this is the case that are probably a little too long for this podcast, but we really need to improve it. And we saw this past summer the passing of a bill, Bill C-70, which is going to create a foreign interference transparency registry, which is a good thing. But it also doesn't cover what happened here, right? Because the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry will only cover those individuals who may be influencing or speaking with government. These individuals were not speaking to government. They were speaking to the wider Canadian press. So we also may have to have a conversation about what kind of transparency do we want around these kinds of activities, and that if foreign countries are providing money to make podcasts at $100,000 a pop, that might be something we need to talk about. But is that then an unreasonable restriction on media freedom? It's not an easy issue, but certainly I think talking about these cases also does help generate more awareness. But we need more cases to talk about it if we want more awareness. So it really is upon our law enforcement and intelligence and national security agencies to step up and do more, especially as they've been granted a lot of the powers they've been asking for this past summer.
I guess we'll see what they do with that in the next few months and years. Thanks, Steph.
Thank you.
Stephanie Carvin of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, author of Stand on Guard. That was The Big Story. For more from us, including previous conversations with Stephanie, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can always shoot us feedback or suggestions for future episodes by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. or by calling us at 416-935-5935 and leaving a voicemail. The Big Story is available everywhere you get podcasts and in your smart speaker when you ask it to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.